Hello, students. This is Jonathan Lipson with The Real Deal on Contracts. Today we're going to talk about the reliance interest as a measure of damages alternative to expectation. If you're in my class, this is Unit 7. We'll talk about three things today. Number one, what are reliance damages? Number two, when are they available? And number three, what are the limits on them? So number one, what are reliance damages? If you step back and think about what we've been doing for the last couple of weeks, we've been talking mostly about expectation as the presumptive measure of relief for the non-breaching party in a contract dispute. Simply means put the non-breacher in the position that she expected to be in economically in performance. But you saw in Hadley that when the seller breaches, the buyer may have trouble recovering lost profits. They might have expected them, but if they were not foreseeable, they will not be considered a form of consequential damages recoverable by the buyer. An alternative that courts developed in that situation, among others, is reliance. Right? You can recover expenditures in reasonable reliance on a contract, even if you cannot recover lost profits. So what are reliance damages? Restatement in Section 349, I think, has a pretty clear definition. They are essentially expenditures made in preparation for performance or in performance by the non-breaching party. That's fairly straightforward. Question is, when are they available? Well, they are an alternative to expectation, which means that if a court concludes that certain kinds of consequential damages are not foreseeable, for example, profits lost are not recoverable, then other expenditures in reliance on the contract might be. Now, in theory, you can't get both your reliance expenditures and lost profit. You get one or the other. And if you think about it, that should make sense. In performance, right, you as the buyer selling, or using whatever you purchased from the seller, would have had to make your own expenditures in connection with the contract. Those would not have been covered by the seller. So under the ordinary expectation measure, usually that's not recoverable if the non-breaching buyer can get lost profits. But if they can't, we say, well, then reasonable reliance expenditures may be an appropriate alternative. To get both, however, would in effect be a windfall, or that's what courts worry about. The issue here, however, is that if you think about it, this means that foreseeability is a problem both with respect to consequential damages as lost profits and with respect to consequential damages as a species of reliance, or reliance rather as a species of consequential damages. Security Stove, one of the cases we read for this unit, sort of talks about how much notice the breaching seller had to have of the peculiar circumstances in which the buyer found itself such that the breaching seller, there a common carrier, as in Hadley, becomes responsible for reliance expenditures, which in Security Stove involve things like traveling to a trade show. Understanding the distinction between the foreseeability test for lost profits and the foreseeability test for reliance damages is sometimes a little tricky. All right, so that's what reliance damages are, number one. Number two, when are they available? Third, what's the limit? First, you can only get reasonable reliance expenditures. If you make expenditures in reliance on a contract that turn out to be unreasonable, maybe you spent too much, maybe you actually knew that the contract was also already breached, those sorts of expenditures are not considered reasonable for reasons that we can discuss in class. Number two, reliance expenditures are generally pre-breach expenditures, and generally they're incurred and recoverable once the contract has been formed. You can also get reliance damages for expenditures prior to formation, but I think they are a little bit more difficult because less likely to have been foreseeable. What about post-breach expenditures? Aren't those recoverable? They are recoverable, but not as reliance damages. Instead, they're recoverable as another form of damages that you've already seen. If you need a hint, they begin with the letter I. Third limit involves what we sometimes call the loser contract problem. This can get slightly complicated, but the basic idea is that reliance, as a measure of recovery, should not put the non-breacher in a better position than she would have been had the seller performed. Which means that if in performance the non-breacher would actually have been worse off than they turned out to be in light of the breach, because, for example, the contract would have been a loser for the non-breacher, then the reliance recovery is probably going to be capped to the extent that the breaching party can show that the contract was a loser. This, too, I think is consistent with the idea that we don't want to allow the non-breacher to use the breach as a way of ending up in a better position than they would have in expectation. It's derived from a case that we read, L. Albert, and is sometimes called the hand limitation. It's captured in the last clause of Restatement Section 349, and is something that we can discuss more in class. And until then, that's the real deal on the reliance interest.